Hello. Story 1. During my college years, I took on babysitting work as a means to earn some extra income without being tied to a rigid work schedule. For the most part, my duties involved caring for a 4-year-old boy from one particular family, typically a couple of times each week when his parents had dinner events for their jobs. The young boy was generally quiet, which I appreciated as it made supervising him straightforward. His activities primarily consisted of watching television and playing with toys, and he seemed to have a positive regard for me. This occasion marked the 6th time I had looked after him. I had arrived at the residence just prior to his parents' departure. They explained that they anticipated being back home around 11 o'clock that night, and emphasized that I needed to ensure the boy was in bed by 9. The initial hours of my time there unfolded as they usually did. I watched TV alongside him and prepared a small frozen pizza for his meal. After he finished eating, he mentioned needing to use the bathroom and was gone for a few minutes. Upon his return, he inquired about shuffling noises he heard originating from the basement. This question caught me off guard, and I promptly switched off the television. Indeed, as soon as the sound from the TV ceased, I could distinctly hear something moving around down below. The noise was quite faint, however, making it difficult to discern exactly what it was. Seeing the boy was clearly frightened by this, I reassured him that everything would be fine and suggested it was likely just a small animal that had managed to get inside. I instructed him to remain upstairs while I went down to investigate the source of the noise. By this point, the shuffling sound had already stopped. I had never ventured into the basement of this house before, as it was unfinished and there had never been a reason to access it. Consequently, I was proceeding with definite caution. I unlatched the door leading downstairs and activated the light switch located near the top of the steps. Subsequently, I descended quietly and also turned on the light at the base of the stairs, which effectively illuminated the entire area. It was a considerably large space, predominantly filled with storage boxes. I walked around, checking behind several boxes, but after neither seeing nor hearing anything else, I returned upstairs. The boy was waiting for me on the couch and quickly stood up when he saw me. I informed him that everything was all right and that nothing was down there, and I gave him a large hug to help him feel better. Within a few minutes, we had essentially forgotten about the whole incident. A couple of hours later, as it approached 9 o'clock, I began preparing him for bedtime. We proceeded upstairs to his bedroom, where I made sure he was ready. I then bid him good night and went back downstairs. I settled onto the couch for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, primarily scrolling through my phone before I heard shuffling from the basement once more. This time, the sound was significantly louder. My heart momentarily stopped as I paused to listen. Then I heard the upstairs bedroom door open, and the boy called out my name. I instructed him to remain where he was and not come down. I got up from the couch and made my way towards the basement door. At this point, I was truly terrified. I took out my phone and had it poised to call 911 as I opened the door as quietly as I possibly could. The shuffling now sounded like it was close to the bottom of the stairs. I reached over and quickly flipped on the lights. Immediately after, I slammed the door shut, dashed upstairs to retrieve the boy, and then went straight out the front door to call 911. I stood across the street from the house, looking towards the windows as I waited for the police to arrive. I also contacted the parents to inform them of what had occurred and urged them to come home as swiftly as they could. When the police finally arrived, I recounted the events to them. As I had initially turned on the lights by the stairs, I had seen a half-naked man crouching down near the bottom while going through a storage box. The officers carefully searched the home and discovered clear evidence indicating someone had recently been living in the basement, including piles of trash stuffed into boxes. However, they did not find anyone there. When the parents arrived, they expressed their gratitude for my call and spoke with the police about the situation. About an hour later, I was permitted to go home after they had secured the house and completed their reports. I spent the next few days feeling profoundly shaken and experiencing significant paranoia. For a couple of weeks, I maintained contact with the parents to see if there were any developments regarding the man, but no updates ever materialized. Eventually, we lost touch, as I no longer wished to continue babysitting. I believe the most chilling aspect of the entire experience was that the man was never apprehended, and he could potentially be residing in someone else's basement right now, without them even being aware. Story 2. My best friend had a daughter named Sarah, who had recently turned 7, and I would occasionally look after her whenever her parents needed childcare. They resided in a very pleasant home situated in Washington, surrounded by abundant trees and mountains. The nearest neighbors were located a couple of miles away, so I consistently found the peace and quiet while staying there quite enjoyable. In any event, my friend had asked if I would be able to watch Sarah for 2 days while she was away on a business trip. I agreed to this arrangement, and a few weeks later, I arrived at her house. We conversed for a short while and had lunch together. Afterward, she finished packing and departed to catch her flight. I spent a few hours with Sarah, listening to her talk about school and her friends. Subsequently, I took her out to pick up some dinner and dessert. We returned to the house around 8 o'clock and decided to watch a movie just before it was time for bed. I settled onto the couch and began scrolling through a list of movies to select one. It was at this moment that I heard Sarah ask me, "Who's that?" I looked towards where she was pointing, which was the front door, and then I heard someone knocking. Given the house's isolated location, I had never anticipated that anyone would come right up to the door. With some nervousness, I walked over and slightly opened the door. A tall man was standing on the porch. He appeared somewhat surprised when I opened the door. "Can I help you?" I asked. He leaned to his left, looking through the crack in the door, then responded, "Sorry, just making sure someone was home." Following this, he turned away and started walking. Naturally, I found this encounter very strange and a little bit creepy. I closed the door and locked it, then proceeded to the back door and secured it as well. Sarah inquired who it was, and I told her it was merely a neighbor, before returning to the couch and starting a movie. We both enjoyed the film, although it turned out to be a bit longer than I had expected. I informed Sarah it was time for bed, and then followed her upstairs as she got ready. Once she was settled in bed, I came back downstairs and sat on the couch. It was a little past 10 o'clock, and I wasn't particularly tired yet, so I decided I would turn something on the television and just relax for a while before heading to bed. As the TV played, I began to hear a crunching sound coming from somewhere. I muted the show and listened more carefully. The sound was originating from the back of the house. I went over to the back door and activated the light for the back porch. Looking around, I couldn't discern anything apart from an empty porch with trees visible in the background. I remained there, listening for a few more minutes, before eventually making my way back to the couch. I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me, as I was feeling a little unsettled, being in a house surrounded by a forest in the dark. During the day, I always felt safe and genuinely enjoyed the surroundings, but as soon as the sun set, I would start to feel a bit uneasy. In any case, I increased the volume on the TV again and opted to lie down in an attempt to make myself feel more sleepy. Apparently, this strategy worked exceptionally well, and I fell asleep on the couch shortly thereafter. A couple of hours later, I awoke, noticing that the TV was still on. I turned it off and sat up, rubbing my eyes tiredly. However, I then began to experience that same uneasy feeling once more, as I became aware of how utterly silent the house was. There wasn't a single sound at all. Then, I started hearing that same crunching sound, but this time, it distinctly sounded like footsteps. The sound was coming from the right side of the house, which was directly adjacent to the room I was in. A few seconds later, the footsteps stopped, seemingly right outside one of the windows that had the curtains drawn. Truly frightened, I walked over to the window slowly and quietly. I then pulled back the curtain. Nothing was there. I scanned the area outside and didn't see anything. I concluded that I must have been imagining it and was simply very tired. So I got a glass of water and went upstairs to get into bed. The next morning, I prepared breakfast for us, and we sat down together to discuss our plans for the day. But as we were talking about what we wanted to do, Sarah asked me why I was walking around outside the previous night. I froze for a moment, then asked her what she had seen. She stated that she had heard someone walking around the house for nearly an hour just after she had gone to bed. Chills went through my body, and I instructed her to remain inside while I went outside to look around. I grabbed a small knife, just in case, and exited through the front door. Walking around the house, it was challenging to determine if anything I saw was from the night before, or if it had already been there. However, I did notice some scratches on the walls near some of the windows and doors. Beyond that, everything else appeared normal. I couldn't tell if there were any footprints because the yard was mostly covered in thick grass. As I made my way back towards the front door, I observed that same man from yesterday walking down the street in front of the house. He was merely walking past, but again, this house was quite distant from anything else, meaning he must have walked at least a couple of miles just to reach that point. I returned inside and told Sarah that we would be going to the mall today to spend time out. I genuinely didn't want to be in the house any longer, so my aim was to spend as much time away as possible. We stayed out for a considerable while and didn't get back to the house until 6 o'clock. My friend called me soon after, simply to check up on us. I brought up the strange man I had seen and described his features to her. She actually mentioned that she recognized the man from a few weeks prior. Apparently, he had come up to her house and inquired if he could stay the night, which she had obviously declined. We agreed that if anything else were to happen, I wouldn't take any chances and would immediately contact the police. As the sun began to set, I made certain to check all the doors one last time to confirm they were securely locked. It was around 9 p.m., and Sarah and I were engaged in a quick board game before bedtime when we both started hearing a soft tapping noise coming from outside one of the windows. I stood up slowly and told Sarah to remain calm, but then a loud scratching sound erupted from outside the walls of the house, right by the window, in the room we were in. I grabbed Sarah and ran into the garage. We got into the car, and I reversed out of the driveway as quickly as I could, ensuring the garage door fully closed before driving off. I couldn't see much in the darkness as we were leaving, but Sarah said that she saw someone running into the trees behind the house. I pulled into a hotel parking lot and called the police to report the incident. I then called my friend to inform them of what had taken place. We were met about 10 minutes later by 2 officers at the hotel, and they told us that 2 more were at the house investigating. I recounted everything to them and provided a description of the man. Eventually, they left. We ended up staying in a room at the hotel for the remainder of the night. The following morning, my friend called and said her flight was just landing and she would be back in an hour. So we headed over to the house. We waited in the driveway for her to arrive. Then we all entered the house together to make sure it was safe. I stayed for a few hours, primarily to discuss everything that had happened, and then I said goodbye and returned home. It was definitely one of the most frightening things that had ever occurred to me. But fortunately, the man was caught a month later after multiple people had reported him for attempting to break into their homes. What scares me the most about this individual was that he never disclosed his reasons for his actions. He had apparently successfully broken into one of the homes, but he didn't steal anything at all. He simply looked around for a little while and then left empty-handed. This always makes me wonder what he was truly attempting to do on the night he tried to break into my friend's house. Story 3. When I was 13 years old, I had a babysitter who would come to our house once a week because my mom worked late every Saturday night. I constantly felt that I was too old to still require a babysitter and resented having someone constantly watching over me. The primary person my mom would arrange to come over was a 20-year-old man named Thomas, who was the son of one of my mom's work friends. I found this guy truly strange and did not like him in the slightest. He didn't speak much and just behaved in a really awkward and peculiar manner. However, whenever he interacted with my mom, he would act exceptionally nice and talkative. I would bring this observation up with her, but she would always respond that I was simply trying to get rid of him so I could have the house to myself. In any case, it was a typical Saturday night, and Thomas had just arrived a little later than usual. My mom conversed with him briefly and then headed off to work. I walked over to the couch and powered on my Xbox to play some video games as a way to pass the time. My usual bedtime was 10 o'clock, so I would typically have to spend 4 or 5 hours with Thomas. Most of the time, I would occupy myself with something alone because he would never really talk to me and would simply spend time in the kitchen or in our loft area. And this night was no different. He remained in the kitchen for a short period, and after a few minutes, I overheard him talking to someone. I attempted to listen as effectively as I could, but I couldn't discern what he was saying. The kitchen was situated directly behind the living room where I was, but he was speaking very quietly. He continued talking for a few minutes, and then the talking ceased, followed by him entering the living room and standing next to the couch. I looked up at him and noticed he was holding his phone. Thomas stated that someone was going to come over just for a moment and that I shouldn't be concerned. I didn't really know how else to respond other than to simply say, "Okay." It was quite weird though, and I knew it was definitely not something any babysitter should be doing. However, I also understood that there was nothing I could realistically do about it. The next 20 minutes felt incredibly awkward, as he didn't take out his phone or engage in any activity. He simply sat there on the couch with me, looking around and saying absolutely nothing. It was quite out of the ordinary for him to ever be in the same room as me. Our living room was located right by the front door, though, so I surmised he was simply waiting for the person to arrive. Eventually, a car pulled into the driveway, and a man came knocking at the door. Thomas quickly got up and went over to the door. He then stood directly in front of it for a moment before turning to me and telling me that he would be back in just a minute. Following that, he opened the door, walked outside, and closed the door behind him. This entire sequence of events made me curious about what was happening with him. The blinds on the windows were slightly cracked open, just enough for me to observe the shadows of the two of them as they moved around in the driveway. I could see that the man handed Thomas a large bag, and then he got into his car and drove away. A few seconds later, I heard the lid of the garbage can outside slam shut, followed by Thomas coming back inside through the front door. The entire interaction struck me as odd, and I couldn't resist asking him what it was all about. Thomas responded by telling me that it was merely his friend, and that he had left his wallet at his friend's house the previous night, so he was simply dropping it off. I could sense there was something off about the way he answered, and his explanation didn't account for the large bag I had seen him holding. However, I didn't want to question him any further, so I just said okay and returned to playing my game. But things became considerably stranger as the night progressed. During the subsequent hour, I could hear Thomas engaged in multiple phone calls with someone while in the kitchen. At one point, he moved to the far loft area, from where I could hear him raising his voice. Still, however, I couldn't make any sense of what he was saying. After perhaps the fifth or sixth call, the same car from earlier pulled into the driveway once more. Thomas immediately ran outside without uttering a word. From their body language and the way they were moving, I could clearly tell that they were arguing about something. Then, Thomas left for approximately 30 seconds and subsequently came back with the bag from earlier. The man took it and placed it in his back seat, then drove off in a hurried manner. Thomas returned inside, and I could see the frustration clearly displayed on his face. He went over to the kitchen and did not come back until 10 o'clock, when he told me it was time to go to bed. I got ready and lay in bed while Thomas remained downstairs. He would typically stay until my mom arrived home at midnight. However, just a few minutes later, I heard the front door open and close. I waited for 10 minutes, then got up and went downstairs to ascertain if he was still there. But sure enough, he had departed. I looked out the window, and his car was also gone. I stayed awake in bed for a few hours, waiting for my mom to get home, and then I recounted everything that had happened to her. She seemed to believe me this time, as she also found the situation strange and considered it truly unprofessional for him to leave the house before she had returned home. The following day, she attempted to call him, but he did not answer. Eventually, though, she managed to get in touch with her friend, who was Thomas's mother, and inquired about what had occurred. Thomas's mother stated that Thomas had come home feeling sick. We both knew that this was a fabrication and didn't make much sense, as he could have simply called her and informed her he wasn't feeling well. Anyway, It has been nearly 10 years since all of that took place, and I still find myself reflecting on how bizarre that night was. I consistently wonder what the two individuals were arguing about, why he left so abruptly, and what contents were held within the bag. Bye.